Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me this morning, and thank you, musicians and music team, for all of your song choices this morning. Each one of those songs is perfectly chosen, so thank you. Well, as you heard, my name's Nathan, and some of you know me. I'm the Adra and Health rep from our conference, so I've just travelled down the road this morning, nice and close for me, close to home at Wallsend. So it's good to be with you this morning, and the sermon that I'm going to share with you this morning, I've titled something a bit unusual. I've called it Domestiques of the Church. Now, I'll explain a bit more about what that's all about as we go through, but some French speakers might recognize the word domestiques. But before we get into that, I wanted to share with you a little insight into one of the greatest sporting events in the world, the Tour de France. The Tour de France is a cycling race that happens each year, and you can see there on the screen a little map of the tour that they did last year. They lap around France as teams of cyclists riding, and there'll be just a few little highlights from some of the recent races on the screen as I kind of explain what this event is all about. For those that aren't familiar, it's the biggest sporting event, live sporting event in the world, bar none. You might get 100,000 people at an Olympic event, or at a soccer grand final, or a football final, you might have 40 or 50,000. But between 3 and 4 million people come out to watch this event live, stand on the side of the road and watch these cyclists ride around France. And what they achieve is quite extraordinary. They do between 3,300 and 3,500 kilometres in 21 days. So there's a few hours in the saddle for these cyclists. And typically they consume enough calories, they eat enough food for 4 or 5 people each day. They're just expending so much energy. It's little wonder when Cadel Evans, the Australian, won the Tour de France a few years ago, he in an interview later on, he was asked, when you were standing on that podium receiving all your accolades, what were you thinking about? And he said, I wasn't thinking about anything except pizza, just because of the sacrifice that he'd been making. For these cyclists who compete in this incredible event, just in one tour, one race, they will climb some of the greatest climbs that you can find, mountain climbs that you can find in the world, the equivalent of. So the amount that they climb on their bike up and down these hills is the equivalent in one race of climbing some of our greatest peaks, like Ben Nevis, Scafell Pike, Mont Blanc, Kilimanjaro, Everest, and more, all in one race. It's quite an extraordinary event. But what you might have noticed there is some team colours as they ride around. Every rider doesn't have their own colour. There's a few common colours going around. So they're broken up into teams, this entire group of cyclists. And it's amazing because it's the greatest team sporting event in the world where the team does not get the glory. An individual wins the Tour de France, and an individual wins a stage of the Tour de France. You know, if you have a soccer grand final or a football grand final, it's a team event, isn't it? The team goes up on the podium, the team receives a trophy, the team partakes in the photo. It's a team achievement. And in cycling, it's no less a team achievement, except one person stands atop the podium, receives the accolades, often the sponsorship deals, the prize money that goes along with it. An individual comes out on top, despite 8 other cyclists riding for him. And there you can see the Australian Cadel Evans winning a few years ago, and that was his team embracing him. In fact, it's such a team event that no single cyclist could enter the Tour de France and win it without their team around them. This is just an example of the type of terrain they have to endure on one single day of the Tour de France. You'll see those climbs there. The peaks there are about 1,400, 1,600 metres. And if you're familiar, our ski fields in Australia, Perisher, Hotham, they're all at around that 1,600 metre mark. So quite extraordinary days in the saddle. But here you'll see one of the teammates doing his job for his team leader. He is what they call the domestique of the team. It's French for domestic, French for help, French for service. Here he is. So what this cyclist has done here, and what you'll notice is that he's got these funny striped colours on him. What's interesting about those colours that he's wearing is that actually means that he's the world road racing champion. That's what those colours denote. But even though he's the world road racing champion in another event, that doesn't mean that in this event he doesn't work as the domestique for his team leader. He's not necessarily the team leader in this race. And what he's doing there is he's ridden back to the team car. You'll see his jacket's full of water bottles, and he's stuffing more water bottles down his shirt. You can see that there? You'll see it here on a few other cyclists. You see his shirt there is stretched to the limit with water bottles down the shirt. And his pockets here, these ones here, are full of food and water bottles for his teammates. Here you go, you see a cyclist, he's ridden back to the front and he's handing them out to one of his teammates. Here you'll see a different scenario. The team leader here has got a flat tyre, and it's his teammate's job, even though there's vehicles that come with spare tyres and whatnot, in order to save time, his teammate is sacrificing his bike. So his teammate has pulled the wheel out of his own bike, thrown it on the side of the road, and is fitting the new wheel to his team leader, and then he gives him a push and sends him on his way. And then he'll pick up his bike, repair it, and keep going in the race. Hopefully to catch back up to his team leader and then sit in front of him to protect him from the wind. Here you'll see another overstuffed jersey, and you'll see quite a number of them actually if you look at the cyclist ahead of him as he rides back up to his team. And here you'll see the team leader in yellow, actually the leader of the race at this point, in yellow. And every one of those black jerseys in front of him is his team. Every one of those black jerseys in front of him is shielding him from something, protecting him from a bit of wind, protecting him from dangers on the road, so they're looking out for potholes and road markers and hazards and those sorts of things. Every one of those team members is there pushing themselves into what they call the red zone, pushing themselves beyond their physical abilities that day. And then when the guy that at the very front of that line can't possibly ride anymore, he just peels off and the next guy pushes himself beyond his capabilities that day. And when he can't ride anymore, he peels off and the next guy does it. It's the most extraordinary team effort for a single person's glory, I think, in the sporting field that we see. Only the rider wearing that yellow jersey stands atop the podium, gets the prize money, although he typically share it with his mates, but receives the sponsorship deals, gets the accolades, has his name listed in the history books. But all of those other 8 riders have sacrificed as domestiques for him. Some days the sacrifice is quite a lot. This is an example here of they're riding along the valley floor. The group of cyclists you can see there at the front are riding at 40 to 50 k's an hour, thereabouts. So I don't know if you've ever tried riding at 40 to 50 k's an hour. 30 k's an hour, you might be able to do it for a little while. 40 k's an hour is sort of, avoiding danger on a roundabout. But doing it for a couple of 100 kilometres a day is kind of impossible for the rest of us. But somebody at the front of that group who's the domestique for his leader will drop all the way back through that train of cars that goes out of sight that you can see there on the screen. That train of cars might go back a few kilometres in some instances. He'll drop back to that car, stuff his jersey with water bottles and food, as we saw, and then he has to accelerate and ride faster than the rest of the group, back to his team leader, distribute all the water bottles, and he'll do that all day. Drop back, pick up stuff, go forward, drop back, pick up stuff, go forward. Quite amazing. And it's quite an example, I think, not just for the sporting field, but for other aspects of our lives in terms of the sacrifice that the team makes for a cause. And in this cause, it's short-term, short-lived, earthly accolades. But in our churches and our Christian lives, we are racing for something so much greater than that, aren't we? Something so much more extraordinary. And it's interesting when you unpack, the Sabbath school lessons have been about at James, but This morning we're going to have a look at some of the messages to the early Christian church and what they were encouraged to do as a body, what they could achieve together in service and sacrifice. And it's quite an example, I think, when we think of what people are willing to do on the sporting field in comparison to other aspects of our life. So let's have a look at a few of these passages, a few of these examples of what we're called upon to do for one another. Let's open up to Romans to start. Let's open up to Romans 12, and we'll begin having a look at a few passages there. In Romans 12, we'll start at verse 9 and we'll read a few of these examples here of things that we're called on to do. Starting at verse 9 in Romans 12. Be sincere in your love for others. Hate everything that is evil and hold tight to everything that is good. Love each other as brothers and sisters and honor others more than you do yourself. Never give up. Eagerly follow the Holy Spirit and serve the Lord. Let your hope make you glad. Be patient in time of trouble and never stop praying. Take care of God's needy people and welcome strangers into your home. Ask God to bless everyone who ill-treats you. Ask him to bless them and not to curse them. And when others are happy, be happy with them. And when they are sad, be sad. Be friendly with everyone. Don't be proud and feel that you are smarter than others. Make friends with ordinary people. Don't ill-treat someone who has ill-treated you, but try to earn the respect of others and do your best to live at peace with everyone. Sounds fairly straightforward, doesn't it? It's not an unexpected passage to open the Bible and see a passage that's imploring us to love and be patient and to serve alongside of, to do away with evil and to strive for good, to serve one another. Not that unusual to read that, but it is extraordinarily difficult in our day and age to have a life that is that tightly black and white defined, isn't it? There's too many people cutting us off in traffic. There's too many bills to pay. There's too many little niggling moments in our everyday lives where the devil works hard to break down, make us tired, make us impatient, for our lives to be a rosy picture like that, isn't it? In fact, if we were to sort of look at these types of passages in the New Testament, the phrase one another is repeated so extraordinarily often, just in the New Testament itself, even if we were to just focus on that area. There's this almost like the writers are imploring the earlier Christian church and reminding them over and over and over about one another. We see it in Romans, we see it in James, we see it in Corinthians, and we're going to have a look at a few more of these. We see it in 1 Peter. Over and over and over, there's some sort of reminder about one another. Let's have a look at another passage over a little way. Galatians 5. Galatians 5. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13. Galatians 5:13. My friends, you were chosen to be free, so don't use your freedom as an excuse to do anything you want. Use it as an opportunity to serve each other with love. All that the law says can be summed up in the command to love others as much as you love yourself. Now that one's particularly interesting, I think, because especially what it says there in verse 13. My friends, you were chosen to be free, so don't use your freedom as an excuse to do anything you want. Maybe another way to say it would be, don't use your freedom as an excuse to do nothing. Sometimes we have rested easy, I think, as an Adventist church sometimes, on the idea that we are, truthfully, saved by our faith. There is no list you can tick off. There is no set of criteria that you can achieve. There is no, a level of goodness that you need to get to for your salvation. We are truly saved by faith. An incredible gift. But sometimes that rests a little too easy, I think, on us. Because we shy away from the good works as kind of a cautionary as a kind of a cautionary approach to not getting caught up in trying to be a good Christian or trying to achieve a certain amount to earn our salvation. But the interesting thing that I think that this passage highlights for us is certainly that we are not saved by our good works, but we are certainly saved to do them, to be them, to reflect them into our communities. And I love hearing stories from all around the churches and our conference of projects and things that are happening, youth groups that are active, and community op shops that are building up networks in their community, and other projects where we're taking care of things like women in suffering violence, taking care of them and helping them escape their situations. I love hearing churches active in their communities. So I think these passages are beautiful reminders for us of what we're called on to do. Let's have a look at another one. 1 Peter, working our way through at the moment. 1 Peter chapter 3. First Peter 3, and we'll have a look at verse 8. Starting at verse 8, it says, "Finally, all of you should agree and have concern and love for each other. You should also be kind and humble. Don't be hateful and insult people, even if they are hateful and insult you. Instead, treat everyone with kindness. You are God's chosen ones, and He will bless you." In fact, if we have a look at that phrase, one another, over and over in the New Testament, we see it attached to a huge amount of action statements. So just some of the examples that are spread throughout the New Testament there are things like wash one another's feet, love one another, honor one another, live in harmony with one another, don't pass judgment on one another, accept one another, instruct one another, greet, agree, serve, bear with, be compassionate, submit to one another. And the list keeps going. Forgive one another, encourage one another. Don't slander or tell lies about one another. Act in humility and fellowship with one another. It's quite an extraordinary list, and when you consider that these messages are being given to the early Christian church, a number of whom had direct contact with Jesus himself or the disciples. The early Christian church was in many ways so fragile because it was so new, but also so close to, in time, the events and the person that created this church. It's quite extraordinary that so often it's important that they're reminded about one another, person to person, real needs to real needs. It's quite incredible. And when I think about what the early Christian church was being implored to do, serve one another, give to one another, I think back to those cyclists in the Tour de France and what they're doing in the sporting arena for one another, the absolute sacrifice that they're willing to make day in and day out. It's kind of, I'm reminded of another passage, I guess, in 1 Corinthians, a passage that's very familiar to many of us, about our church bodies being like a human body, that our communities are like a human body. In that, for the body to function, we needed quite a number of parts, don't we? Working together, working well, for us to function optimally. I can't stand up here and speak to you this morning if I haven't been able to digest my food. It would be more difficult to stand up here if I, only had one leg perhaps, or if I didn't have my balance this morning, if I was a bit dizzy, it would be quite difficult to stand up here. All of the parts of our bodies work together, as we know, hopefully in harmony. And we're reminded in Corinthians that our church body is like that. But I think about our communities as well, beyond these borders, beyond the fence line. And I imagine what it would be like if every church in our conference was a bit like one of those Tour de France cycling teams. A network of people with complementary abilities, all working for one glory, one outcome, sacrificing, giving, challenging, doing the hard work of going back to the car and collecting all the water bottles and riding up to the team leader, in whatever that might look like in your community here in Erina. In fact, let's have a look at another passage. John 13. We're given a command. This is more of a command than a reminder. John 13, and we'll start at verse 34. John 13:34. But I am giving you a new command. You must love each other as I has loved you. And if you love each other, everyone will know that you are my disciples. So if we're to love each other just the way that Christ has loved us and the way that Christ has loved the church, then what does that look like? Well, a different John, let's jump over to 1 John, gives us an example of that answer. It tells us how Christ loved us. So 1 John. First John chapter 3 and verse 16, starting at verse 16. We know what love is because Jesus gave his life for us. That's why we must also give our lives for each other. If we have all we need and see one of our own people in need, we must have pity on that person, or else we cannot say we love God. Children, you show your love for others by truly helping them and not merely talking about it. Now that's a challenge, isn't it? We know what love is because Jesus gave his life for us. And we're challenged to, commanded to love each other, our communities, the way that Jesus loved us. And he died to demonstrate his love. In the cycling arena, the cyclists push themselves to the extreme physical limits to show their sacrifice for their team. And I think it's a beautiful challenge for our churches right across the conference, wherever we're located, that we can be a shining light of Jesus into the community. But it is going to take some effort and some sacrifice sometimes. It's going to take challenge, and it's going to take getting our hands dirty, might even make us uncomfortable from time to time. But it's the extraordinary calling that we have by the gift that we are given in salvation freely through faith. So as you go about your week, as you go about planning your church, community, life, the ways that you're going to impact your region around you, remember the Tour de France cyclists. Remember the challenges that they go through so that one guy can stand on top of the podium, wear that yellow jersey, receive the accolades. It's quite an extraordinary event. If you ever have the opportunity, if you're ever in Europe traveling, a bit of a holiday, and get the opportunity to see the event itself, go for it. It's quite an amazing thing to see. But the stories after the Tour de France each year are incredible. Riders that have crashed multiple times, and I heard a few of you gasping as you saw some of those crashes on the screen. But that when they crash, they don't just, get a stitch or two. They'll get 20 or 30 and then keep going on their way. But the stories that come out each year at the end of the Tour de France are amazing. Riders that have continued serving their team leader through bronchitis, riders who have had multiple stitches, or have ridden with broken bones frequently. A lot of riders ride with broken collarbones, broken wrists and broken elbows. All that time on a bike, sacrifice for their team leader. As you plan your church outreach, your church life, I encourage you to think of those guys and what they're willing to sacrifice. Because the New Testament writings to the early church are filled with not commands, but reminders, and the writers imploring the early church to remember each other in a similar sort of way, to remember to sacrifice for each other, to remember to support, uplift, serve, be patient with each other. And I believe that phrase, one another, refers beyond the doors of this church, and it includes our neighbours and those in our communities who we serve. So I just encourage you to remember those cyclists as you pray and plan your programs. Thank you. Lord, we just thank you for the ultimate sacrifice that you give us an example by dying on the cross, Lord. And we just pray that as we go about our daily lives, as we plan our church events and church programming, that we have your eyes to see the opportunities around us, to see the community the way that you see it. People that have needs, people that might be hurting, people that have questions that we could perhaps answer, Lord. We just thank you for the ability to serve you freely, and just pray for the wisdom and courage and energy to move forward, Lord, in your name. Amen.